on is a collaboration with the NAACP and many community members to reform the school board election system. Currently, Dubuque school board members are elected at an at-large basis. That is, every registered voter in the district votes for each member. At-large campaigns are expensive by comparison to ward campaigns, since candidates have to reach not only voters from their own neighborhoods, but also voters throughout the district. The current system thus favors candidates that have a lot of disposable time and income. It also prevents many good prospective candidates from running. Changing to the ward system would reduce the cost of, reduce the cost and time it would take to run a campaign, making it more accessible. In addition, the ward system would ensure that all neighborhoods have at least one board member who is expected to represent their interests and hear their concerns, and who is directly accountable to the voters in that neighborhood. The present system privileges those with wealth and elite social connections. A more representative democratic election would open up opportunities for participation by people in all income brackets, in all neighborhoods. We have petitions available on both at the front door, and then also we can pass them around if you're from Dubuque and you believe that this issue is something that Dubuque voters should have an opportunity to vote on in November. Please, Naomi can pass it around to you. Changing the way school board election systems are run is only the beginning of how we can address issues facing our school district and our education system. We recognize that the issues are many and are best understood by those most immediately impacted by them, our teachers. Teachers come to school every day prepared to educate our children, but they often face significant barriers to doing the job. A lack of financial resources, the lack of mental health providers in our schools, and the complex and demanding social and emotional needs of so many of our students are just a few of these barriers. Over the last few years, many of us have been inspired by the courage and commitment of teachers' unions in Chicago, West Virginia, LA, and many other places, who have organized themselves and used their collective power to demand more for themselves and for the students they love and serve. We want to learn from them how we can use the power we have together to make Dubuque a place where all children can thrive. That is why we've asked Eric Blanc to join us today. Eric is formerly a high school teacher and current DSA member who now writes on labor movements from the past and the present. He's the author of Red State Revolt, The Teachers' Strike Wave in Working Class Politics, which is available for purchase today near the front door. Sensing the importance of the wave of teacher strikes moving through the country, Eric embedded himself into the rank and file leadership of these walkouts, where he was able to experience firsthand what it takes to organize a powerful and effective movement for change. In this talk this afternoon, Eric will offer us lessons from the teacher's strike and how to think about how we too can change our community for the better. Please join me in welcoming Eric Blanc.
Thanks, Christine. How are y'all? I don't know if I need.
Please use it.
I will use it. How are y'all doing? Good? Okay, yeah, it's really nice to be here. It's my first time in Dubuque, and already had a lot of productive discussions with teachers and organizers, and yeah, it's a really exciting moment, I think, for anyone who's thinking about trying to save and defend and transform public education, and anyone who's a radical or socialist as well. And so what I want to do today is open a discussion with you all and do two things. First, try to get you as excited as possible about the strike wave that's spreading across the United States in education, and try to talk about its significance. And the second thing I'll do after is try to draw out some of the big lessons that we can, learn from these movements for any of us who want to do something similar or fight back against the billionaires and win. So, with no further ado, I appreciate Christina's gonna help with the slides. So as a former teacher, I'm going to subject you to some of my teacherly ways, including graphs. And so this first graph is the total number of educators that went out on strike in recent years. And you can just see this incredibly dramatic increase, right? Almost 400,000 educators struck in 2018 alone. So that doesn't even include all of the recent strikes in 2019 in places like Los Angeles, Denver, Oakland, and beyond. And if you were to take that back even further, the chart will look the same. So what we're seeing is the highest by far number of educators on strike in the history of the United States. The second chart here is maybe less immediately known for a lot of folks. It's the average size of the strikes. And again, so this goes back to 1945, and again you can see this dramatic increase. And in 2018, the average size of the strikes was almost 25,000 workers per strike, which is again the highest in the history of the United States. And so for a little crowd participation, why do you think that was the case? What was it about the strikes in 2018 that would have made them so much larger than strikes in year prior? Anybody? There's no wrong answers. That's not actually true. There's a few wrong answers, but there's some that are closer to being right.
So prior strikes, like especially in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was also a wave of teacher strikes, were mostly localized. So they would involve like a district or a smaller area, and then for the first time in 2018, they had statewide.
Yeah, did everyone get? I've got a plant in the audience, so yes. The answer is that they were statewide, unlike most strikes, which are localized. These sort of spread out of the existing confines of the way you're supposed to normally do this, and it spread statewide. First in West Virginia, then in Oklahoma, then Arizona, Kentucky, North Carolina, Colorado. And because they were so massive and so widespread, it's one of the reasons they won so much. So the strikes were large, and they were also very successful. So you're talking about people won in the span of weeks more than they'd won in some places for decades. In Oklahoma in particular, but also Arizona, you're talking 15-20% pay raises in places where the state hadn't increased taxes since like the early 90s in Oklahoma and West Virginia. They got significant pay raises, defeated attempts to almost double their healthcare costs, pushed back against efforts to privatize. So you can see that these types of strikes and strikes in general can win. And I think that's what's so exciting about the moment we're in, is that working people aren't just fighting back, but they're fighting back and winning. And that's why the strikes have continued to spread, because when you see an example of victory work, it makes sense to try to emulate that if you can. So the last graph here is the total number of workers, not just education, but workers in general that have struck in recent years. And it breaks it down by industry, which is why I like this graph. So you can see again, almost 500,000 workers total on strike. You can see the decline in manufacturing as a definite trend since the 80s. And just what I would point to here, so here in purple is the rise in education as percentage of strikes. But it's also just worth thinking through the other industries that struck. Because here in gray, there's two other big industries that had major strike numbers in 2018. Does anyone know what they are? One more crowd input.
I think restaurants.
There was a few walkouts in fast food, but not in large numbers.
Hotels?
Yeah, hotels is one, and anybody else? Hotels and healthcare. So nurses in particular. So you have education, hotels, healthcare, and it's just worth thinking through what the similarities are amongst these industries. The most immediate, I would say, and the most relevant, just to highlight, is that these are overwhelmingly female industries. And so what you have is a labor movement right now, a strike wave that's led by women workers, and I think that's just really exciting and important and worth foregrounding from the offset. So when we think about what the significance of these strikes are, beyond just that they won a lot, part of the victory is that they changed the way we talk about the crisis in public education in the United States, right? And to give an example of that, how we used to talk about the schools until very recently, I found two Time magazine covers. So the first is, does anyone know who that is all the way on the left? Michelle Rhee. You can hiss if you want. You don't need a hiss, but you can if you'd like. Yeah, so Michelle Rhee. Who's Michelle Rhee?
The former head of the Washington schools.
Yeah, so she's like privatizer-in-chief of the Washington, D.C. schools, downsize them, privatize them, fought against the union. And that, according to Time magazine, is how you're going to fix America's schools. That was 2008, and this is 2014. Rotten apples. It's nearly impossible to fire a bad teacher. Some tech millionaires may have found a way to change that. So, a very lovely article, highly recommend it. Again, so presumably, according to Time and really the discourse in general of both Democrats and Republicans, the problem with public schools is that teachers are a block towards progress, that unions are a block, and that just the public sector is inherently less efficient and less productive than the private sector. So what you need to do is bring in charters, bring in accountability, which basically means teaching to tests, and then getting punished if you don't do that. And up until recently, this was widely accepted across the political mainstream, and that changed, seemingly overnight because of the strikes. So much so that the most recent Time magazine cover on education, just this last year, you might have seen it, is I have a master's degree, 16 years of experience, work 2 extra jobs, and donate blood plasma to pay the bills. I am a teacher in America. And so the reason you saw this shift was not that the owners of Time magazine gained some sort of moral conscience overnight, which they did not, but was that the strikes were so overwhelmingly popular and so overwhelmingly successful that they changed the narrative. They changed the common sense about how we talk about schools now. And so now it's actually quite common, not even just amongst Democrats, but even some Republicans to say the schools are underfunded, teachers aren't getting paid enough. According to polls, you have 76% of the population that nationally supported the teacher strikes and their demands, which is a game changer. It's like astronomically high numbers. And so in that context, the way that the politicians have been forced to talk about the schools has changed pretty dramatically. Doesn't mean we've won the policy changes that we need yet, but at least the rhetorical battle has shifted so much farther than we could have expected even a year ago. So it's really an important win and sets the precedent now for winning more political changes in the years to come. And so the last big transformation, I would say, just worth highlighting beyond the way we changed the narrative, was just the transformation of the people who participated in the strikes themselves. And I found that, to be honest, this was the most moving thing, because as Christine mentioned, I spent a lot of time on the picket lines, and I was in all of the strikes kind of on the ground. So I talked with a lot of different people, and I like talking to the organizers, but I think what I found most moving was actually talking to people who had never been political before, who had never gone to a union meeting, and who even oftentimes would have told you, and did tell me, a week or two ahead before the strike, that they didn't even think the strike was possible. They weren't even sure if they were going to participate. And oftentimes it was those very people who, once they were out on strike, became the most fiery picket line captains. They were the people that didn't want to go home, afterwards, after the strike was over. And they would get their coworkers to drive them back to the Capitol every day, even if it was like 5-6 hours. There's all these small stories of just like personal sacrifice and solidarity that in their totality, you have tens of thousands of people surrounding you at a Capitol every day. Just the way you look at people you work with, the way you look at your city, the way you look at your state has changed, and the way you look at yourself has changed. And people came away with a sense of power that is really, really hard to take away. Because once you get a sense that you can change the world, you don't really want to go back to the way it was before, in which you just were resigned to accepting what was happening to you, right? And that, I think, ultimately is hopefully going to be the biggest legacy of these strikes, that gave large numbers, literally hundreds of thousands of workers, a sense of power. And for every one of the educators that struck, there was dozens of students, dozens of parents. And so you're talking about literally millions of people who went through their first experience of mass strikes, and that's going to set the precedent now for really, really rebuilding a labor movement in the United States and a struggle to not just defend, but transform the schools into the ones we need. So the question then is, why did these struggles win, and what can we learn from them? And I want to highlight 4 big lessons, hopefully to spark a discussion amongst us all about what we could do here in Dubuque, or in Iowa, or more generally. So the first lesson I would stress is that the strikes fought not only for the teachers who went on strike, but really for the community at large. And that's really significant because it's different than the way a lot of unions are perceived and the way that unions have behaved in the past, where oftentimes unions have been seen and sometimes been just another pressure group or a special interest in which people are they're fighting for themselves. And this is really the major argument that a lot of the right wing uses, right, against unions to discredit them. Oh, these greedy unions, they're just want a little bit more. And so in order to combat that narrative, it was super important that they did what you saw in Los Angeles, but really across the board. So here you can see a student carrying a sign that says, "Educators deserve a fair pay raise." And then you can see a teacher with a sign, "Our students deserve smaller class sizes." And so you have this combination of teachers really fighting for not just themselves, but the community at large. They fought for smaller class sizes, they fought for a nurse and a counselor in every school, they fought for more funding for their students. This was one of the major demands in all of the strikes. In LA, they fought for Similarly in Arizona, anti-racist demands, they were able to force the district to stop racial profiling of Black and Muslim students inside the schools, which was a really major victory. And they were able to raise all of these demands that were able to bring in the community and make it clear to the politicians that they couldn't isolate the workers, and that in fact the workers had the support of the majority, of which they did. Even in a place like Oklahoma or Arizona, you had 74, 75%, according to even the mainstream media polls, were supporting the strikes. And I don't think you would have had that had the unions and the strike leaders not taken this kind of broad approach. The second big lesson is that the strikes, in order to win, most of them had to break the law. And that's actually pretty important to note, because labor law in the United States is set up for us to lose. It's actually one of the most anti-democratic, as far as like political democracies in the world. Our labor law is one of the most restrictive when it comes to just labor movements. It's very hard for our side to win within existing legal confines. And so specifically, it's very hard to strike. And it's not just a red state thing, as many of you in Iowa know. In most states of the country, public sector workers do not have the right to strike. Only 13 states have the right to strike if you're in the public sector. And in the private sector, you technically have the right to strike, but it's so restrictive and there's so many laws that it's almost impossible in practice to implement that right. It's sort of a right on paper. So what you see then is a labor movement that hasn't been able to resort to its main weapon, right? Because our main weapon as working people is to withhold our labor and force management to listen to us until we go back to work. And one of the reasons why the labor movement has declined for so long in our country, really for decades, has been that that weapon has been taken from us, and the labor movement has been reluctant at best to try to take it back. And so what was so exciting about these strikes, and you can see this sign here saying this was once illegal too, which is a reference to Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement. And this was in West Virginia after the Republican politicians threatened to fire the workers who actually wanted to go on strike and then now were on strike, and they kept on threatening that they would get fired if they didn't go back to work. And I don't think we should romanticize breaking the law. It was really, really scary for a lot of people. And I was there, and a lot of folks were terrified about losing their jobs, because you can imagine if your kids or your significant other depends on you to pay the rent or to eat food or to have health care. It's not a risk you take lightly, right, to put that on the line. And so it's actually a really big deal if you think about it, that so many people were able to take that risk of putting their livelihood on the line. And ultimately the argument that won out amongst folks was that if we all do this together, what are they going to be able to do? They're not going to be able to come after all of us if we all go out together. And that ended up actually being true. That's what ended up happening, is they all did go out together, and the Republican politicians who were threatening them with fines or threatening them with getting fired didn't end up acting on those threats. And when I interviewed the Attorney General or some of the other politicians afterwards, I said, well, why didn't you act on what you were threatening to do? And they said, to be honest, we were worried that it would have backfired on us, because the teachers had so much support amongst the public that if we thrown them in jail or we had fired them, we would have risked an even larger public outcry against us. We would have risked the strike spreading to other sectors of the population. And so the law then becomes a relationship of forces if you have enough people on your side. And that's a really important lesson if we're going to be able to fight back and win, especially in a place like Iowa, where now the law is really restrictive and very hard for labor unions to fight back successfully. This isn't even a lesson. I just like this photo, which is from Oakland. It's a student right before this going to the picket line saying, "I don't like the boss." It's just a cute kid with a class struggle image. So pause. We'll go to the next one now. There. The third big lesson is it took a lot of organizing to make these strikes happen, and that's important to stress, because I don't know if you remember when the media started covering the strikes, they oftentimes just portrayed it as almost spontaneous uprisings. Like, all of a sudden, teachers are rising up, their pay is low, and they rose up. And the reality is that vastly underestimates the extent to which it was necessary for months of organizing to get to the point where the strikes were possible. And that's significant because it wasn't just that pay was low, because pay has been low for a very long time in these states, and that didn't immediately lead to strikes. And in fact, there's parts of the country where teachers are paid even less and they haven't struck. And most workers actually in all of these states get paid worse than teachers, and they haven't struck either. So it's not just that the worse you are, the more likely you are to strike. There's a lot more going on. And part of it is that organizers had to give people the confidence and help people gain the confidence themselves that they could do something as ambitious as going on a statewide strike. And so in West Virginia, this was Jay O'Neill and Emily Comer. They were the two people who ended up really initiating the teacher strike in West Virginia. And they did that in the summer of 2017, so 8 months before the strike began, by doing a study. Both of them had first gotten organized together through the Bernie Sanders campaign. They were young teachers, and they joined the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, so congratulations to our comrades, and you can be proud of being an organization with folks that initiated the strike wave. And they did a study group of a book called No Shortcuts by Jane McAlevey. Has anyone read that? It's really good, right? You should read that book. Don't read my book. That's the book to read. And it's basically a book about how do you build mass strikes and how do you do working class strategy. And they did their best to try to implement that in West Virginia. The difficulty was they were just rank and file teachers. They didn't lead their union, so they didn't have the resources to fully pull it off. But what they were able to do was start getting the ball rolling. So they talked to their coworkers, just one-on-one, a lot of one-on-one conversations. They got their coworkers first at their schools and then across the state to wear red on the same day as a sign of, the movement is growing. They created a Facebook page that eventually went viral. They did silly memes, and I have to say, I was actually pretty skeptical of social media until these strikes, and now I'm a firm believer in the power of memes. It makes a big difference. And they were able to basically generate enough pressure from below to force the unions to call a strike vote and then go out on strike. Because the unions in none of the red states, at least, the LA was different because in LA the radicals actually led the union in the same way in Chicago and Oakland. But in the red states, the unions had to get pushed from below, from the ranks, to go on strike. And that took a huge amount of organizing from rank and filers from below to make that happen. And so I think that's an important lesson for those of us who are organizing anywhere, because oftentimes it's really, really difficult and demoralizing because we don't just look around and see our coworkers wanting to rise up. It's definitely not the case that just everyone is riled up all the time. Oftentimes, things are so bad that people just get demoralized, right? Things being really bad doesn't automatically lead to resistance. And so it takes organizers, and often a very small core group of organizers, to kind of be crazy enough to think that they can pull off something big and then to get other people on board. And so I do think that's an important and hopefully inspiring lesson for those of us who are trying to do something similar where we're at. And then the last big lesson I would stress is that the strikes challenge this narrative that there's not enough to go around, right? This scarcity narrative that there's just not enough money for public schools, and really generally there's not enough money for universal health care, there's not enough money for a clean environment, there's not enough money to end climate change, there's not enough money for basically all of the needs that working people have. And so it's important to stress that because the Republican politicians and also the corporate Democrats, they didn't just tell teachers, oh no, we don't like your demands, we don't like you. They didn't tell students, no, you suck, XYZ, we don't want to give you anything. They basically pretended to be on the side of the strikers everywhere. They said, we love education, we would love to give you everything you want, but have you looked at the budget? There's just not enough money. So please go back to work. We have nothing to give you. And so in that context, it was super important that the leaders of the strikes and the rank and file organizers were able to say, that's BS. There's more than enough money in our state to have a quality public education for every single student. And the reason we don't have that now is literally just because the billionaires and corporations for decades in our state have been getting tax cuts, and the public coffer has gone from giving these public services to the ultra-rich. And so in order to get the schools we need, in order to meet our demands, that money is going to have to ultimately, and in the short term, come from the small group of really rich people that aren't paying their fair share. And they were able to make that case convincingly because it wasn't just rhetoric. They were able to do the research and show exactly how the numbers lined up. If you reverse the last 5 years of tax cuts, this is how much money you would be able to have for the school. If you reverse the last 10, 15, and so much so that in a place like LA, not just the teachers, but the students and the parents on the picket line could cite you the specific numbers of exactly how much money was going to be needed to get the schools they deserved. And so I think ultimately that's an important lesson for us, because we can do need to say that there's more than enough to go around, and that the only reason we don't have that right now is that the rich and the billionaires aren't paying their fair share. And that is an extremely powerful and ultimately very radical message, because the teacher strikes have raised people's expectations. People now, as we talked about earlier, feel like they deserve quality public education, teachers deserve more, students deserve more, and that type of lesson and that type of momentum can shift. Because if you can do that in education, why don't we deserve a Green New Deal? Why don't we deserve Medicare for all? Why don't we deserve housing for all? Right? All of these things, which right now seem fanciful, already in this moment now people are starting to feel like, actually, well, maybe that makes sense. Things that really sounded extremely radical just a few years ago now become part of the public mainstream discussion. And so, by way of conclusion, it's just worth thinking about the moment we're in politically, because sometimes when you live through history, you don't fully, I think, realize the extent to which things are changing. And we're living actually in an extremely momentous, time in U.S. history. It's scary because of Trump and the rise of the racist right and climate change and all of the things that we know. But it's also, I think, extremely inspiring because for the first time in a very long time, millions of working people are fighting back. It's a big deal that it's the first strike wave in decades, right? That's significant. And it means that I think we need to raise our expectations a little bit higher for what we can do as organizers and activists, because if you look like at Arizona or Oklahoma, if you had asked me to list states in 2017 where I would not have expected there to be a successful mass strike, Oklahoma and Arizona would definitely been in the top 5, maybe top 3, right? And nevertheless, in those states of all places, which are like hardly bastions of liberalism or radicalism, they were able to have these massive strikes, right? And I think that the lesson for us is that means that really in most parts of the country, working people are looking for an alternative to the status quo, right? The status quo, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, at this moment is extremely discredited. And so it means that actually as socialists, we have an obligation to put forward a clear alternative and to have confidence that when we do, millions of people will seize it, and that we need to not only put that vision out there, but have confidence that we can organize really massive historical change together with our coworkers and together with the community at large. And so, I'm excited about having a discussion with you all to think about what exactly that would look like here and across the country. So thanks for coming out. And I always forget, I'm a terrible salesperson. You should get a copy of the book also because I'm donating the proceeds on my end to a strike fund for Red State strikers. So definitely please get a copy afterwards and I'll sign it. And but hopefully we can open it up for Q&A. Is that the idea? Are you facilitating or should I just ask?
You could probably just ask and we'll be able to run the mic.
So I can turn it off? Okay. So do folks have questions or comments?
I was wondering, just as an example, do you think the new Chicago council here, with the 6 declared socialists, entering it now, might be more receptive to, just for some nearby city might have more influence on, to be more receptive to changes to the school board that's been very resistant to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so for people who don't know, in just the recent city council or alderman elections in Chicago, 6 DSA members got elected. So it's a really big deal. It's actually the highest percentage of socialists in a city government in decades. And I think you're right. Yeah, having socialists there has already made a difference because now education will see it's very likely the Chicago Teachers Union will go on strike in the fall or spring. They're talking about it already. So it'll make a big difference that some of the people in government are going to be on those picket lines as opposed to having whole government against you. It'll give them a leverage point to at least make the argument to the public at large on why the teachers are right. But even more recently, these same council people, just this last weekend when Trump was doing his immigration raids, right? Those council people were literally biking around, sometimes driving, following and getting in front of the ICE trucks to try to warn people and to do whatever they could to prevent deportation, as many deportations from happening as possible. So it's really remarkable because these are activists and socialists who now have this institutional leverage to try to raise people's expectations, win some things, and block the worst of what the other side is trying to do. So yeah, I do think it makes a big difference.
And with regards to Chicago, the support staff have authorized a strike over 90% accepted. So Could you talk about the role that support staff had in assisting the strike and how the narrative around, if not solely a teacher strike, but there were so many other players in the wave, and how could organizers incorporate the other workers that aren't typically at like the headlines?
Yeah, that's a super good question. The way that the strikes were talked about, these were teacher strikes, right? Like that's the word. Sometimes we use it as a shorthand. But really these were workers, these were strikes of all school workers, which is to say that the custodians went out, the bus drivers went out, the secretaries went out, all of the different employees that are necessary to make a school run. If any of you worked in a school, you know that it's not just the teachers, you can't really have it work without them. And so particularly in West Virginia, the support staff were actually in some ways the critical turning point for the strike at two key junctures. One was when folks weren't sure whether they would go out on strike or not. And the bus drivers specifically played this critical role because in West Virginia, the geography is such that students actually depend on the buses to get to school. Like that's the way, because of the mountainous region, there's not public transportation, they depend on them to get there. And so when the bus driver said, we're not driving tomorrow, we're not driving next week, when the strike was about to start, that ended up actually galvanizing the last kind of wavering teachers who weren't sure whether this would happen or not, whether they would themselves go out. Because the bus drivers said they weren't going, that was it. And the same happened when the strike went wildcat halfway through. You might remember in West Virginia, the union tried to stop the strike halfway through, and there was a tremendous amount of confusion. And again, and I was at these meetings, you saw bus drivers said, I don't know if the teachers are gone out, but we are not driving the buses tomorrow. The schools will be shut. And so that really played this key role. And so I do think the big lesson for us as educators, but also just workers, is that if you're going to fight back and win, you do need to try to organize everybody in your industry or your workplace, and not have just certain sectors of workers, because you're just power so much more if you're able to completely shut down your institution.
So they must have been included in the bargaining in the ask. What
Yeah.
they were asking for, like support staff and the bus drivers.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons they were able to do that, is that in West Virginia there's not actually collective bargaining, and so in some ways that was terrible because it made it very hard in years prior to get anything done. But it also meant that when they went to the Capitol, they could just sort of make whatever demands they wanted. So their demands were on behalf of not just all school workers, but actually all public employees. They were demanding an end to this proposal to massively increase their healthcare costs, and they were demanding a 5% wage increase for all public employees. And so, so it was consciously included. And the way the inclusionary thing played out most of all wasn't just the demands, but all of the meetings stopped being just specific union meetings. There was actually 3 separate unions, and a lot of workers aren't in any union, and they just started having school-wide meetings in which everybody who's a school worker and all school workers in the state would meet together, rather than breaking it down by what type of worker you were or which union you were in.
Building on that point, does the difficulty with them, when things are within the collective bargaining standpoint, are they then limited in the process by Taft-Hartley and by other laws that actually give people more freedom outside of that structure sometimes?
I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. Generally speaking, more collective bargaining is better than none, because it gives you some institutional leverage. The difficulty in the United States is that collective bargaining, for the most part, has gone hand in hand with all these other restrictions. So you have collective bargaining, but not necessarily the right to strike. And so your actual ability to do serious collective bargaining is kind of hamstrung, because the other side is so much more powerful institutionally than you are. So I think the solution isn't to reject collective bargaining, but to fight for, to democratize it, to make it more real. And even in the very restrictive confines of collective bargaining as you have it, you can still fight back and win. Chicago and LA are these examples. They went through, those were not illegal strikes, mostly. They were working within the confines of the collective bargaining system, as restricted as it was, and they were able, because they built such a significant, deep organization, to still have a successful strike. So you can do it, but it's hard, and I think each sort of structural condition or context has its own strengths and limitations.
What's your assessment of the post-strike ability for this movement to stay organized, and what's that look like? How has it faltered? How is it successful?
Yeah. So for people who didn't hear, yeah, what is the state of the movement after the strikes? You know, it really depends. It looks different in every state. The first thing to say is that literally thousands of people joined the teachers' unions in the midst of and after the strikes, which is really important because this shows again that the best way to build a union isn't just by like making the case to people one-on-one why they should pay dues, but it's by showing why you need a union in the first place, which is that with a union you can fight back and win. And that, you know, that becomes self-evident to a lot of people on like why you would want to participate in it. So that happened, and so you have thousands of new members, and the unions for the most part really have gotten this influx of new energy. That being said, the right wing didn't just like say, oh, we lost, oh well, we better start, you know, we better just throw up our hands. They immediately, as you could expect, tried to reverse the gains that have been made. So in West Virginia, for instance, just this last spring, the right wing tried to push through privatization efforts to bring in charters and vouchers to West Virginia and to further penalize striking. And the West Virginia teachers had a second strike. I'm not sure, a lot of people missed this, but there was another statewide 2-day illegal strike just this last spring, and they won. And then again, just 3 months later, the Republicans again brought it to the legislature, but this time they waited until teachers were out of school, and they waited until the summertime so teachers couldn't strike. And this time, they again failed to push through vouchers, and they failed to get more penalties on striking. But they did get a significant victory is that the right wing was able to push through a few charters in West Virginia. So it's definitely not the case that the schools are what we need or that everything is just rosy now. The movement is definitely stronger in all of these states, but you know it's hard to sustain that level of energy indefinitely. You can't just strike all of the time. So I do think that the place where they went furthest in sustaining the energy was Los Angeles, because they had an immediate plan afterwards, the strike, which is they pivoted to a progressive taxation plan to reverse Prop 13, which some of you might know is this like extremely regressive law passed in the 70s that sort of like kneecaps the state by giving billions of dollars in tax breaks to commercial property and like big corporations. And so they were able to use the strike energy to move directly towards what I was talking about earlier, is like make the rich pay. And so because of that, they were able to kind of keep energy higher than in which some of the unions were like, now we're just going to go back to like trying to elect Democrats.
How did that figure in? Did they, as the strike was coming and as it was going on, were they already talking about that and sort of like a smooth transition?
Yeah, they already were talking about it in the process of the strike, you know, and you know, they were setting themselves up to the members to be like, look, the battle has just begun. So you would hear that a lot in the strike. This is just the first battle, and it was going to be a long war. So people were already kind of in that while they were there and on strike, were like, oh, this isn't going to end in a week, right? And that's important because that's not so obvious to folks. Did you have?
Yeah, I had a question about the illegality of the strikes, which, you know, relating more specifically to Iowa. I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand the statute against strikes that we have for public employees here, in Iowa it's not only illegal to go on strike, it's also illegal to offer any form of support to other strikers or to advocate for striking. So you can't even talk about a strike, and like the penalty here would be like loss of certification and being banned from working in your school district for a period of years and stuff. And I was wondering, that seems to me to present like a special challenge to the labor organization in Iowa, even more so than in other states, because like this Facebook group where people come in and say, that in the book, like the Facebook groups where people said, you know, we need to think about a strike. Well, in Iowa, that's a situation where I could be called in by an administrator and threatened with, you know, termination just for saying it, which, you know, I'm not sure that would totally stand up in court. Maybe it'd be like an ACLU thing about freedom of speech, but again, I mean, it's even more draconian, it seems, here.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is those same threats were being made also elsewhere, even if the law was less explicit. So the situation was very similar, which is to say that people were getting threatened with losing their jobs. And I think then the thing is, at this moment, it's very hard, and I think this is the argument you have to make. If other people are like, it's inconceivable, you have to say, actually, at this moment, it's very hard for legislators to resort to repression against teachers. There hasn't been a single case of a teacher getting fired this whole strike rate yet. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And the reason for that is that teachers, in particular because of their position in the community, really have this kind of wellspring of support, especially at this moment. So it could be, it's a risk. I mean, I'm not saying like they couldn't do anything, but if you had a large enough people to start doing it collectively together, I think that the thing is you can test the waters. And this is what happened elsewhere. They tested the waters. They started talking about it. And the state, the state isn't always sure what to do. Because sometimes if they come in Iowa, because some people are talking a strike, all of a sudden they like try to discipline somebody, then it gets on the media. And and then other people start talking about it. So they actually think twice before resorting to repression, because a lot of times it backfires. So, I don't think it should be precluded for the same reasons. Really, the situation in Iowa is not very different structurally and legally from a lot of other places. If anything, the unions here have more of a tradition and are stronger, and so you could lean on that. It's not that long ago that people remember when they had more rights. So the legal barriers probably seem a little bit less legitimate to a lot of people because they're more recent.
You talk about this wellspring of support in each of the communities. I guess what I'm trying to figure out, and I'm trying to follow up with your question, is the support that they have from the community. Were there any local elections after the strikes that they were able to elect pro-public education supporters, or I don't know if it's a local election, but I don't think there were probably any state elections. I want to see how long this can be sustained, because clearly the ultimate goal is to get politicians on the state level and the local level that are going to support education elected.
Yeah, it's tricky. There was definitely a good amount of public education politicians got elected, including, somewhat strangely, there was this phenomenon in some of the states where Republicans, people would run because they were like independent Republicans who are culturally on on social issues, or Republicans, but who, because they saw the strikes were so popular, and maybe also just for genuine reasons, were like, oh, I'm a public education Republican. So you saw that all over. And similarly, you had Democrats who in the past, who, to be honest, were more likely to cut schools than to support them, now come out and say they're for the schools. So there was definitely a shift in the rhetoric and in a lot of people running. That being said, the difficulty is there wasn't a direct translation in any of the states just towards like more strikes, more progressive candidates getting elected. Because unfortunately, most of the people who run are still not wrongly perceived to be part of the establishment. People have a very hard time getting excited about them. And especially because a lot of the Democrats that people were supporting had, not that long ago, participated in governments that had imposed these same policies, right? So there was not like a clear, for the most part, a very clear alternative on who could be like actually on the side of the educators. And so I do think that that poses a question about, the extent to which the Democrats are actually seen as a force for public education, given that, in a lot of these states, their record has been just as bad across the board. And teachers remember that, people aren't that. People remember that not that long ago, the Democrats were in power in these states and imposed these policies. So it's not so obvious how to get beyond that, at this point.
The reason I ask the question is because eventually the community gets tired of strikes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you go on strike one, you're successful, the next year you go on strike, you're not going to be successful, you're going to lose the support.
Yeah.
That's where you've got to figure out how to take that energy and continue it and change the leadership.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's one of the reasons why I'm so excited actually about the Bernie Sanders campaign, because on a national level, you've seen that. And then you also see, socialists are getting elected across the board, and, the people who've been most consistent, people who are actually like on the picket lines, were the further left, activists and politicians, some of whom are getting elected now. And so Bernie, for instance, is calling for a national moratorium on charter schools, for a standard base of 60,000 for teachers. And so it's like he is not wrongly perceived by a lot of educators as one of the few politicians who's been kind of like consistently on their side. It's like when they were striking and he wasn't even running yet, he was there. And so I think we need more kind of radicals like that as politicians to be like the kind of tribune for the public education movement. I don't think you're going to see the like Democratic mainstream do that because they're still too tied to the billionaires.
And going off that, like looking at our unions, so like national, like NEA, like the candidates that they endorse is also, so I think some of it is looking at membership and saying like, which candidates are we endorsing and why? And oftentimes we're going with really safe centrist Democrats. So part part of getting those people in power is using the power of the union. I saw or read where the NEA, they were trying to make it so that it would be a democratic vote by members to be able to endorse candidates, and that failed at convention.
Yeah, so some of the people, literally some of the leaders of the West Virginia strike and the Arizona strike were just at the NEA, which is the biggest teachers union, national conference, the RA in Texas 2 weeks ago. And yeah, they proposed this, that, it should be up to the members to decide, but put up for a vote who the union should endorse, because in 2016, both the teachers unions did a very early endorsement of Clinton, which pissed a lot of people off. And so to not replicate that, people are like, just let us vote, right? And the leadership, and this is a good, example of how difficult it is when you have the top union leaders who are very tied with the Democrats. They said, oh, we're going to listen to people. They did everything. They said, we're going to listen, we want to consult, make your voice heard. And people were like, will you let us vote? And they said no. And they fought really hard to make that lose. So it does, I think, pose the question of also to get more progressive, like real progressive politicians, I think we're also going to need to change our unions to stop just endorsing really bad corporate Democrats. Any last questions?
On the public support question, I noted in your description of the recent strike actions, teachers, hotels, healthcare, all of which are very public facing. I mean, they have customers who are immediately impacted, students, hotel guests, patients. And the ability to replace strikers with qualified personnel is pretty limited. And that's the tool that in other cases employers will use. Well, we're going to fire you because we have easy access to replacements. My question is, how much of the public support do you feel was due to genuine, organic interest and support for the teachers versus, hey, this is really messing up my life, let's get it over with, give the teachers what they want?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, if anything, precisely because public sector strikes do become kind of a nuisance or a real crisis for folks, that's one of the reasons why historically oftentimes they've lost, not because they've won, right? Because that can very easily turn against teachers or whoever, It can very easily be like, go back to work, I don't have money to pay for my kids to have childcare, I need to go to work, like what am I going to do with my kids? It's a real thing, right? And so, in some ways I think that people supported the teachers despite the inconveniences that it posed for them, because it really was an inconvenience for folks. And so I think that there was a genuine understanding just politically that teachers were fighting for the students and teachers had kind of gotten a bad break, and that it was worth making some small sacrifices ultimately, because this was going to be in the benefit of both their kids and the public at large. So I do think that it was genuine in that sense. It was definitely not like just a reaction to the inconveniences, because if anything, that type of just like immediate reaction tended to go more in the opposite way, which was to be against the teachers.
Were there any efforts in the planning and ancillary strike support to sort of head off those worries about regress, like large kids don't have anywhere to go or things like that?
Yeah, so it was a huge part. I mean, part of it was the demands, as I mentioned earlier. It was very important that the demands were broad, but then also just the organizing was extremely conscious about winning over parents and students. So, some of the things you might have heard about were in all of the states, the strikers raised thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to basically be able to provide food for students who relied on free or reduced lunch, right? And so sometimes they hand deliver them in the evenings. In West Virginia, this was a thing because a lot of working people there just didn't have the money to even go to a free pantry or a church to get food. So the teachers would hand deliver food in the evenings, house by house, to to the families they knew that were really, really poor, because there was a lot of them there. And that went, it went really far towards making it clear that, clearly it's the teachers who are trying to help the students, because the politicians aren't showing up at my door to help make sure that my kid has something to eat the next day. So I think the small acts of reaching out to the teachers or to the parents were very important. And then there's a lot of smaller stuff too, like they did what they called walk-ins in all of the states, in which you have, rather than walk out, you have parents and students and teachers meet in front of the school before school starts and have sort of a town hall type meeting, just to what's going on, and that built this level of common solidarity. people got to know each other and kind of got committed to the struggle as a common goal. Do one last question.
So what other public sector workers do you think these kinds of techniques could be translatable to?
What other public sector workers specifically?
Well, any, actually.
Any, yeah.
But
The most obvious, that's a good question. I mean, the most obvious example would be healthcare workers. You know, and it's one of the reasons you've seen the second most number of strikes was healthcare, because the structural similarities that you mentioned as well are quite similar, which is you're providing a service. Even some of the demands were very similar. So the parallel demand to smaller class sizes is one of the central demands in all of these healthcare strikes has been nurse to patient ratio. So it's almost identical, right? Because the schools or the for-profit or even the non-profit hospitals are refusing to basically have decent standards for the types of services they're providing, which makes it way harder on patients and recipients of the services and then on the workers themselves. So this is a very common sort of structural dynamic. And to be honest, we haven't even organized like most of the schools. We haven't even organized most of the hospitals. So even if we were just to limit ourselves to these two sectors for the coming years, that you could have a massive increase in the labor movement, a massive number of members, a massive increase in the number of strikes. You know, so there's that. I would say the extent to which it can spread elsewhere is the $64,000 question. I don't know. It's very hard. I think in the private sector right now, a lot of people are very scared, and a lot of workers don't necessarily feel like they have that public support already. That being said, it's worth thinking about just how the federal government shutdown ended. So we'll end on an optimistic note. Because as you might remember, the longest federal government shutdown in history, it didn't end because Pelosi did anything, but because the air traffic controllers, where I live in New York, called in sick, right, that Friday, and because the flight attendants union, led by Sarah Nelson, who's a radical union leader, flight attendants union threatened to strike the next day for safety reasons, right? And that ended up ending the federal government shutdown. And when the press interviewed Sarah Nelson at the end, they said, "Where'd you come up with this crazy idea of strike to end the federal government shutdown? Like, what in the world are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, if the teachers are doing it, why can't we?" And so, you know, it was very explicit. And so this idea, if the teachers are doing it, why can't we? I hope is going to be something we'll see a lot more of. But it's going to take, it'll take a lot of organizers to make that happen. It doesn't just happen. So yeah, I think that's it.